came to the ballroom for business, but a 7-year-old's hand on his sleeve threatened to rewrite the past he thought he'd buried. Welcome back to LessonLit, the channel where every video brings you unforgettable tales of love, loss, and second chances. Watch till the end, and don't forget to leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from and rate this story from 0 to 10. The chandeliers dripped golden light across the ballroom like frozen rain, every crystal prism scattering 100 reflections onto the marble floor. Music drifted from the orchestra at the far end, a lilting waltz that carried fathers and daughters in graceful circles. Laughter rang between the pillars, high-pitched and pure, the kind of laughter Robert Anderson usually found grating at these charity functions. Tonight was no different. He stood near the edge of the dance floor, a glass of scotch balanced between his fingers, the amber liquid steady despite the restless tapping of his foot. To everyone else in the room, Robert was exactly where he was supposed to be. An immaculately dressed CEO fulfilling his social obligations, shaking hands with investors, nodding at board members, and appearing engaged in whatever pleasantries they expected. Inside, however, he was far away. Children's causes had never stirred him. He funded them, of course, public image demanded it, but his heart remained locked in the upper floors of Pinnacle Tower with profit margins, market expansions, and boardroom battles. This glittering dance was little more than another box to check off. "Robert, good to see you," one of his colleagues said, clapping him on the back. "Quarterlies look solid. We're still ahead of projections." Robert allowed himself a thin smile, raising his glass as if the amber liquid contained all the interest he could spare. He murmured polite words, already scanning the ballroom for an escape route. That was when he felt it, a tug at his sleeve. At first he thought it was one of the servers brushing past, but when he glanced down, his breath caught. A girl stood there, no older than 7, with chestnut hair that curled at her shoulders and a pale blue dress that shimmered under the lights. A satin ribbon tied at her waist trailed down like a stream. Her chin tilted upward, and her hazel eyes, clear, steady, and impossibly familiar, locked on his. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steady but strangely formal for a child. She extended her small hand. "Would you dance with me?" Robert blinked, unprepared. A child's request at a father-daughter dance was nothing unusual, but this wasn't his daughter. He had no daughter here. He had no daughter at all. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," he managed after a beat too long. "I think you've mistaken me for someone else. Your father must be around here somewhere." But the girl didn't flinch. Her hand remained outstretched, her gaze unwavering. "No mistake," she said with quiet conviction. "You're Robert Anderson, CEO of Pinnacle Technologies." She drew a breath, as though steadying herself against the weight of what came next. "And you're my father." The words landed with the force of a blow. For a moment the music receded to a muffled hum, and the chandelier's brilliance blurred into a dizzying haze. Robert stared at her, every detail of her small face burning into his mind. The determined chin, the wide hazel eyes, the hint of his own smile lurking beneath her composure. He heard himself whisper, hoarse and disbelieving, "That's not possible." Her voice did not waver. "My name is Emma Grace Anderson. I'm 7. My birthday is March 18th. My mom is Sarah Wilson." She blinked up at him with a composure that seemed too old for her years. "You left when she was pregnant with me." Robert's glass trembled in his hand. Scotch sloshed over the rim onto his cuff, but he didn't notice. His colleague had stepped back, giving them space, but Robert could feel the weight of a dozen eyes from across the room. Whispers were rising, threads of gossip weaving into a net he could feel tightening around him. CEO, secret daughter, charity gala. Emma glanced toward the dance floor where the orchestra still played. "So," she said simply, lifting her hand again, "will you dance with me? Just one dance. That's all I came for." Robert swallowed hard, the smooth veneer of control he wore in boardrooms slipping from his face. The simplest of questions, spoken by the smallest of voices, had undone him completely. He looked down at her waiting hand, delicate fingers stretched toward him, as though she were offering not just a dance but something more, something he hadn't realized he had lost until now. Slowly, with a hand that trembled more than he wanted to admit, Robert set his glass on the nearest table. He reached down and took her hand in his, the contact sending a jolt through him. "Just one dance," he echoed. The orchestra swelled, the chandeliers shimmered brighter, and together they stepped onto the floor. Robert's hand hovered above the child's, the scotch glass now forgotten on the table behind him. The ballroom, moments ago a swirl of laughter and chandeliers, seemed to still. He heard the orchestra carrying on, violins sighing in graceful arcs, but it all faded into a muted thrum. Every detail of the girl before him, her pale blue dress, the ribbon tied too carefully at her waist, the proud set of her chin, pushed against the walls he had built around himself for years. but it was her eyes that froze him. Hazel, wide and filled with a kind of knowing that no child should carry. His mother's eyes, his own eyes. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," Robert managed at lay. "See," his voice low, more fragile than he intended. "You must be mistaking me for someone else. Your father must be here somewhere." Emma didn't move. Her small hand remained extended, steady as a challenge. "No mistake," she said. There was no tremor in her words, no hesitation. "You're Robert Anderson, CEO of Pinnacle Technologies." She paused then, lips pressing together in a line before she added, with deliberate clarity, "And you're my father." Robert felt the floor shift beneath him as if the marble had cracked open. For a heartbeat, he wondered if it was a cruel prank, some opportunist's child sent to rattle him. But the truth was there, undeniable, in her face. The high cheeks, the arch of her brows, the faint birthmark just visible near her collarbone, Sarah's chin, his eyes. The past roared back like an old wound torn open. He bent slightly, lowering his glassy gaze to hers. "That's not possible," he whispered. She didn't blink. "My name is Emma Grace Anderson. I'm 7. My birthday is March 18th. My mom is Sarah Wilson." Her hand wavered for the first time, but she lifted her chin higher. "You left when she was pregnant with me." Robert's chest tightened. Sarah. He hadn't spoken her name aloud in years. He could still see her, framed by their apartment door, her hands clenched into fists, her voice breaking as she said the words that he had dismissed as manipulation. Pregnant. He'd thought it was desperation, a last-ditch plea to keep him from leaving. He had walked out that night, suitcase in hand, his heart barricaded against guilt. Now guilt pressed in on him from every direction. On the dance floor, violins swelled again as fathers lifted their daughters into the air. The applause of the crowd fell like a slow wave across the room. Robert felt 100 eyes crawling across his back. Already he could imagine tomorrow's headlines. Tech Titan snubs child at charity ball. Emma followed his gaze, then leaned closer, lowering her voice but not her resolve. "I don't need you to be my dad," she said. "I just want one dance. That's all." Her words cut sharper than any boardroom betrayal. He swallowed hard, set his drink aside, and placed his hand into hers. It was shockingly small, warm, certain. He let her guide him onto the floor. They found a spot near the edge where the chandeliers bled light across the polished floor. She placed her free hand delicately on his sleeve, just as she must have seen the other girls do, and began to lead him. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Her lips moved with each count, and her little shoes slid with surprising precision. "You've been practicing," Robert murmured, struggling to keep his voice from breaking. "Michael helped me," she said, matter of fact. "He says I'm a natural. He takes me to things like this sometimes." Robert's stomach nodded. Michael, his longtime vice president, his right hand at Pinnacle. Michael had been the one Sarah turned to. The thought sent a flicker of heat, jealousy, sharp and irrational, through Robert's chest. Emma looked up at him, her hazel eyes cutting through the fog of his pride. "You didn't know about me, did you?" she asked again, as if daring him to lie. He froze mid-step, then knelt until their eyes were level. His voice was rough. "No, I didn't know. Not really. I should have believed her, but I didn't." Emma studied him with a seriousness far beyond her years. "So you didn't leave because of me? You just didn't believe Mom?" The weight of her words struck harder than any shareholder's accusations ever had. He shook his head slowly. "I didn't know you were real. That was my mistake, not yours." For the first time, her composure cracked. Her lips trembled before curving into a small, tentative smile. "That's better," she whispered, and for an instant Robert saw not a stranger's child but his daughter, his blood, his second chance. Before he could answer, the orchestra drew the song to a final flourish, and the applause swelled again. A sudden commotion stirred near the entrance, a ripple of voices cutting through the music. Robert turned his head just in time to see the door swing open. There she was, Sarah. She stood framed in the golden light, her dark hair swept back, her chest rising and falling with hurried breaths. Her eyes, stormy, searching, scanned the crowd until they locked with his. In that instant, 8 years dissolved into nothing, and Robert felt the old wound split open again. At her side stood Michael, shoulders squared, jaw clenched, his presence steady and familiar, the shadow of judgment in his expression. Emma's small fingers tightened on Robert's hand. She leaned in, voice suddenly fragile. "That's my mom," she whispered. "She's going to be so mad." Robert straightened, instinct pulling his hand protectively across her shoulder. He had never looked more like a father, though he still wasn't sure if he deserved to be called one. And as Sarah began to move toward them, her eyes sharp with fury and fear, Robert realized something with a chill that spread through his veins. The single dance he had just agreed to might be the one step that unravels everything he thought he knew about his life. The applause from the orchestra's final notes still echoed against the high ceiling when the double doors banged open. The air shifted. What had been a golden, glittering evening now trembled with a new electricity, sharp and cold. Robert looked up and saw her. Sarah. She stood in the doorway of the Westfield ballroom, framed by the brilliance of the chandeliers, her breath coming fast as if she had run the whole way. Her eyes, dark, fierce, and all too familiar, swept across the room like searchlights. Next to her loomed Michael Thompson, his tall frame taut, jaw set, scanning the crowd with a protector's vigilance. Emma felt her mother before she saw her. Robert felt the little girl stiffen, her fingers tightening around his hand, clutching him as though he might disappear again if she let go. "That's Mom," she whispered, her composure cracking for the first time all evening. "She's going to be so mad." Robert's instinct, honed not in family rooms but in high-stakes boardrooms, was to retreat. But instead, something else surfaced. An impulse deeper, quieter, more ancient. He placed his free hand on Emma's shoulder and straightened his tie as if the gesture might shield them both. "With good reason," he admitted, though his voice was unsteady. Sarah's gaze locked with his, her face drained of color, then flushed with something sharper, hotter. For a heartbeat, the years fell away, and Robert was back in that small apartment, hearing her voice tremble as she said words he hadn't wanted to hear. "I'm pregnant." He had left then, walked out the door into the night, his phone buzzing with his father's hospital call in one ear and Sarah's broken sob in the other. He had chosen silence. He had convinced himself she was trying to trap him, that it wasn't real. Now the proof stood beside him, 7 years old, wearing a blue dress with a ribbon knotted at the waist. Sarah pushed theirs, roughed the crowd, her steps quick and sharp, every click of her heels like a countdown to judgment. Guests whispered as she passed, "Isn't that Sarah Wilson? Isn't that Anderson? And who's the child?" Cameras shifted, lenses hunting. Robert's stomach turned. "Mom," Emma said when Sarah finally reached them. Her voice was small, guilty, as though she'd been caught sneaking cookies before dinner. Sarah dropped into a crouch, face inches from her daughter's. "Emma Grace Wilson, what were you thinking? Sneaking out of the house? Taking an Uber by yourself? Do you have any idea how dangerous—" She stopped short, choking on her own words, her hand tightening around Emma's shoulders. "I thought you were gone. I thought—" She pressed her lips together, fighting the tremor in her voice. "I just wanted to meet him," Emma said, her tone as steady as her gaze. "I needed to know he was real." Robert flinched. He, not Dad. A man in a suit, a title in the newspaper. A ghost. Sarah finally straightened, her eyes flashing with fury as she turned to him. "How dare you?" The words came out sharp, a whisper of steel. "How dare you dance with her, speak to her, without calling me immediately?" Robert swallowed hard. "She only approached me 15 minutes ago. I was trying to—" He searched for the right word, but everyone tasted false. "Process it." "Process?" Sarah's laugh was short and bitter. "I told you I was pregnant. Do not stand here in front of our daughter and pretend you didn't know." "I didn't believe you." The admission slipped out before he could stop it. He hadn't planned to say it aloud, but the truth pressed on his chest until it had no choice but to escape. "You thought I was lying." Sarah's voice cracked again, and she shook her head. "I called you for weeks after you left. Weeks. Your number was disconnected. Your lawyer sent me divorce papers with no mention of the baby. And Michael—" She stopped herself, glanced at the man beside her, then back at Robert. "Do you have any idea what that did to us?" Robert looked from her to Michael, whose hand hovered protectively near Emma's shoulder. The jealousy that had pricked him earlier now flared into something raw. Michael had been there for Sarah, for Emma, for the years Robert had thrown away. "I thought you were bluffing," Robert said, the words cracking as they left him. "We were already breaking apart, Sarah. I thought—" "Thought what?" Her voice was sharp, low, dangerous. "That I invented her, that I would use a child as bait to keep you? You walked away because it was easier. Admit it." Emma's hazel eyes darted between them, her hand still in Robert's. She pulled at his sleeve again, her voice a soft interruption. "Are you going to dance with me or not?" Robert froze, caught between the weight of Sarah's fury and the gravity of Emma's simple, impossible request. He looked at her, the tiny, determined figure who had crossed a city to find him, who stood before him like a mirror of the life he had denied. And for the first time in years, Robert Anderson felt something stronger than ambition. "Yes," he said at last, his voice raw. "Just one dance." The orchestra began again, the room swelling with music, but Robert barely heard it. He stepped forward, took Emma's hand, and let her guide him. The crowd parted, cameras flashed, and in the distance, he saw Sarah watching, her face unreadable. The past was no longer behind him. It had found him, and it wasn't letting go. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and quiet fear, a sterile contrast to the golden glow of the ballroom where this all began. Robert had stood on 1,000 stages, faced investors who would tear empires apart for a decimal point in a quarterly report, but nothing had prepared him for the sight of his daughter's name printed neatly on the whiteboard outside a pediatric oncology room. Emma Grace Anderson, room 407. His steps faltered. His name alone was enough to stop him cold, like a verdict etched in ink. For 7 years he had moved through life convinced he had outpaced the past, that the memory of Sarah's tear-streaked face and those words, "I'm pregnant," were buried beneath quarterly reports and international flights. But here it was, scrawled on a hospital board in a child's handwriting, proof of his own cowardice. Sarah walked 2 paces ahead of him, her posture rigid. She hadn't said much since the gala, just instructions. "Meet me tomorrow, 9 a.m., don't be late." She carried herself with the kind of practiced strength he'd never seen in her before, the kind forged in long nights and endless worry. Michael was there too, hovering close enough to support her if she faltered. Robert could feel the man's presence like a weight pressing against his ribs, a constant reminder of the role he'd abandoned. Inside the room, Emma sat cross-legged on her hospital bed, a chessboard balanced carefully before her. A nurse adjusted the drip line connected to her arm. When the door opened, Emma's head turned, her hazel eyes lighting instantly. "You came," she said, the same words she'd used at the gala, but now her voice carried a fragile tremor beneath its practiced steadiness. Robert managed a nod, his throat too tight to answer. "Of course I came," he whispered at last, lowering himself into the chair by her bed. The hospital chair felt harder than any boardroom seat. "I said I would." Emma gave a small, approving nod, as if checking off a box on a list. She slid a knight across the chessboard with deliberate precision. "Check," she said, eyes flicking toward Michael. "I've been practicing with him when Mom's at work. He always lets me win, except when he forgets." Michael gave a sheepish smile from his seat in the corner. Robert felt that same twist of jealousy, sharp and unbidden, but this time it was laced with something else, gratitude. Michael had been here when he wasn't. A knock at the door interrupted the moment. Dr. Olivia Martinez entered, a slim folder in hand. Her expression was composed, but Robert noticed the careful gentleness in her eyes. "Mr. Anderson," she greeted, nodding to him. "Thank you for coming in this morning. We've received the initial test results." Robert stood quickly, almost knocking over his chair. "And?" She motioned for him to step outside, but Emma's gaze sharpened. "Why can't I hear it too?" she asked. Sarah was at her daughter's side in an instant. "Sweetheart, it's just some medical talk. We'll explain everything, I promise." Emma's lips pressed into a hard line. "You think I don't know what's going on? This is a children's hospital, and you're not here for a checkup, are you?" The room went still again. Robert felt her eyes piercing through him, demanding honesty. He crouched beside her bed, careful not to disturb the IV line taped to her arm. "Emma, what do you know about your condition?" She sighed as if tired of repeating herself to doctors and adults who underestimated her. "I know my bone marrow doesn't work right. It's lazy. It doesn't make enough red blood cells. That's why I'm always tired. That's why I get the transfusions." She tugged lightly on the plastic tube at her arm, then looked back at him. "But the medicine isn't helping as much anymore. Mom said, sometimes kids like me need a transplant." Robert froze, the word catching fire in his chest. "Are you getting tested to give me your bone marrow?" Emma asked, her voice quiet but unwavering. He hesitated. For years he had told half-truths and evasions, letting silence do the work of cowardice. Now, with her eyes on him, his eyes wide and steady, he couldn't lie. "Yes," he said. "I am." Her lips parted. "Does that mean I'm getting worse?" "Emma," Sarah began, but Robert raised a hand gently, still holding his daughter's small fingers in his. "It means we're exploring every option," he said carefully. "It means your mom has fought harder for you than anyone I've ever known. And it means, if I can help you, I will." Emma studied him for a long moment, her small face shadowed by the fluorescent light. "Will it hurt you?" Robert forced a smile, though his chest ached with an unfamiliar fear. A little, but not for long. She tilted her head. Would you do it anyway, even though you just met me? The question hung in the sterile air, heavier than any he'd faced in a boardroom or negotiation. His answer came without hesitation, surprising even himself. Yes, I would. Her hand squeezed his, soft but fierce. Good, she whispered, because I've been waiting for you. Before Robert could respond, the door opened again and Dr. Martinez stepped back into the room. Her voice was calm, professional, but edged with gravity. Mr. Anderson, we'll need a little more blood work to confirm, but the first results are promising, very promising. Robert glanced at Sarah, then at Emma, who was watching them both with wide, expectant eyes. For the first time in years, he wasn't calculating profit margins or market share. He was calculating hope and realizing how terrifying and how precious that hope could be. The world had shrunk to the rhythm of machines. Beeps, steady and insistent, filled the pediatric ward like a second heartbeat. Robert sat in a stiff plastic chair beside Emma's hospital bed, his tailored suit exchanged for a set of paper scrubs that made him look strangely ordinary. His tie, his armor in every negotiation, lay discarded on the tray table. In its place, he held a stuffed bear, Emma's constant companion, that seemed to weigh heavier than any business deal he had ever signed. 6 days had passed since the gala. 6 days since he first took his daughter's hand on that polished floor. 6 days since Sarah's words had gutted him and Michael's watchful eyes had cut deeper than any investor's scrutiny. Now every hour was counted not in profits but in hemoglobin levels, white blood cell counts, and whispered consultations with Dr. Olivia Martinez, who carried charts the way generals carried battle plans. The night before the transplant, Robert stood at the wide hospital window looking down at the city as headlights crawled like fireflies across the streets. Behind him, Emma's voice drifted through the room, reciting chess moves to Michael as though she were conducting a tournament. The sound tugged at him. His daughter, building strategies, seeing moves ahead, carrying that quiet sharpness he recognized in himself. She had grown up under someone else's watch, but still, without him, some fragment of him had found its way into her bones. Sarah entered with a folder tucked under her arm, her face shadowed by exhaustion. Her scrubs were wrinkled, her hair pulled into a careless knot, but her presence still had the same gravity that had once steadied him. She handed the folder to Dr. Martinez, then leaned against the wall, folding her arms as if holding herself together. The doctor's eyes softened. We've got the full results. Mr. Anderson, you're a strong match. The transplant is scheduled for tomorrow morning. The words hit him with a weight heavier than the whiskey glass he had dropped days earlier. This wasn't speculation anymore. This was fact. Sarah let out a breath she had been holding, and for the first time in years, Robert saw her shoulders sag in relief. Thank God, she whispered, a hand rising to cover her mouth, then softer still, almost to herself. She has a chance. Emma's head turned sharply from the chessboard. A chance? She repeated, her small voice cutting across the room. What do you mean? A chance for what? Sarah froze. Robert could see the calculation in her eyes, the instinct to protect, to shield, to soften the blow. But Emma was watching, hazel eyes sharp as glass. There would be no easy lies with this child. Robert crouched again at her side, meeting her gaze. It means, he said, forcing his voice steady, that if the doctors give us the green light, I can help. I can give you something your body needs. My bone marrow. For a heartbeat, Emma just stared. Then her lips trembled into a small, brave smile. I knew it, she whispered. I knew you could. The innocence in her certainty split Robert's chest wide open. She doesn't doubt me. Not like her mother did. Not like I doubted her. But the moment fractured when Emma tilted her head, her eyes narrowing with sudden sharpness. Does it hurt? She asked. Robert hesitated. In boardrooms, hesitation was weakness. Here it felt like honesty. A little, he admitted, but not for long. She studied him, her hand clutching his with unexpected strength. Would you still do it? Even though you just met me? The question should have paralyzed him. Instead, the answer came without hesitation. Yes, even if it hurts, especially if it hurts, because you're my daughter. The words were out before he could think, and yet for once he didn't want to pull them back. He felt the truth in them as surely as he had felt the tug on his jacket sleeve. Emma's eyes softened, her shoulders relaxing. Good, she whispered, then added almost playfully, because I already told my teacher you'd come to career day. She said not every kid's dad shows up. Robert blinked, caught between laughter and heartbreak. She had planned this, every step, every word, as carefully as she plotted her chess games. The door swung open again, and Dr. Martinez's voice cut through the fragile bubble. It's time. Nurses rolled in equipment, sterile trays gleaming beneath the fluorescent light. Sarah bent to kiss Emma's forehead. We'll be right here the whole time, sweetheart. Her voice shook but held firm. Emma reached for Robert's hand again. See you on the other side, she said, her eyes locking with his, filled with unshakable faith. Robert squeezed her fingers, his throat too tight for words. He had made billion-dollar promises to shareholders and partners, but none had ever felt like this. Count on it, he whispered at last. They wheeled her away, her pale blue ribbon fluttering like a small flag in retreat, and Robert felt the echo of her grip still burning in his palm. For the first time in years, he wasn't afraid of losing a deal. He was afraid of losing the one thing he had only just discovered he couldn't live without. And somewhere behind him, he knew Sarah and Michael were watching, silently wondering whether this man who once chose ambition over love, could possibly rise to the role his daughter had already assigned him, father. Snow dusted the rooftops of Manhattan like sifted sugar, glimmering in the faint glow of street lamps. From the top floor of his penthouse, Robert Anderson stared out across the city he had once believed was his only child. The empire of glass and steel he'd built with sleepless nights and ruthless decisions. For years, the skyline had been his family, the blinking red antenna lights his lullaby. But tonight, as the city prepared for Christmas, all he could think about was the girl who had turned his life upside down with a single question. Can I dance with you? Emma, his daughter. 7 years old then, 9 now, her hair growing in again after months of treatment, her hazel eyes shining with a strength that startled him. She was the reason he stood here in paper-thin pajamas with a scar along his hip where doctors had drawn marrow from his bones. She was the reason his board had watched him walk out of meetings without apology. She was the reason he was about to step once again into the Westfield Hotel ballroom, not as a guest, not as a CEO on display, but as a father walking beside his child. The ballroom glittered brighter this year, as though the chandeliers themselves remembered the night she found him. Twinkling strands of lights ran across the vaulted ceiling, and the polished floor reflected it all like an endless pool of stars. Reporters clustered at the edges, cameras already clicking. The annual Children's Hospital charity ball had become something else entirely this year. Everyone knew the story now. The missing girl, the CEO father she discovered, the transplant that had saved her life. The world loved the narrative. Redemption, innocence, family. It was the kind of headline you couldn't invent. Robert adjusted the cuff of his tuxedo, though his hands trembled. Sarah stood to his left in a sapphire gown that caught the light with every step. 2 years of nursing school had etched new strength into her posture, but the guardedness in her eyes remained. On her other side was Michael, dignified in a dark suit, quieter now, no longer Emma's stand-in father but still her anchor. The three of them walked together, not as rivals or estranged lovers, but as something far more complicated. An arrangement stitched together by necessity and against all odds, affection. Emma trotted ahead, her small hand clutching a telescope's instruction manual as though it were scripture. She had been named champion of her school's chess club that fall, and now she was the mastermind behind the gala's science corner, where children could peer through telescopes at a wintry sky. The alignment is tonight, she whispered, spinning in her purple dress, her favorite color. Jupiter and Saturn side by side. It only happens once in a lifetime. Robert smiled faintly. Seems I'm making a habit of being found under the stars. Emma turned back and grinned at him, no longer hiding her joy as she had that first night. Her hazel eyes, his eyes, sparkled with a confidence that both humbled and frightened him. You didn't run away, she said. You came back. He wanted to answer, but the orchestra began to play the familiar waltz, the very same song from 2 years ago, when a stranger in a pale blue dress had stopped him cold. This time it was Emma who extended her hand, no longer trembling, no longer uncertain. May I have this dance? She asked, the words an echo of the past, but filled now with hope. He didn't hesitate. I'd be honored. They stepped onto the floor together. He expected her to count under her breath as before, but she didn't. She moved with grace, leading him effortlessly through the turns, her small frame poised and sure. He realized she had grown into the very thing he had once been too afraid to be. Steady, unflinching, unafraid of connection. As they spun beneath the chandeliers, Emma looked up at him, her expression suddenly serious. Dad, she whispered, the words still new enough to sting and heal at once. I have a question. Robert's heart clenched. The last time she had said those words, his life had collapsed around him. Another life-changing one? He asked, forcing a smile. Maybe, she said, tilting her head. Do you think you and Mom will ever get back together, like Madison's parents did? The music carried them across the polished floor. Robert felt every eye in the ballroom again, every camera lens like a spotlight. For a moment, he couldn't speak. He saw Sarah standing with Michael at the edge of the dance floor, her hands clasped in front of her gown, her expression unreadable. He could lie. He had built a career on selective truths, but Emma's hazel eyes pinned him, daring him once more. Sweetheart, he said finally, his voice low and rough, your mom and I, we care about each other. We'll always care. But sometimes people are better together as friends than as husband and wife. Emma's lips pressed together. For a moment, disappointment flickered in her eyes, but then she gave a small nod. That makes sense, she said, though her voice was quiet. I just thought, maybe. Robert pulled her closer, resting his cheek against her soft hair. Maybe not as a couple, he whispered, but as your family, always. The song swelled into its final turn, and he spun her once, her purple dress flaring like a comet's tail. She laughed, a sound so full of life that the entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath in awe. Later, when the music had faded and the guests were drifting toward the exit, Robert found himself standing on Sarah's porch once more, a small wrapped box in his hands. Inside was a framed photograph of Emma as a newborn in her incubator, tiny fists curled against her cheeks, and beside it, a silver chain. At the end of the chain hung a delicate charm, a star, hammered and imperfect, fashioned from a thin sheet of silver. She wanted you to have it, Sarah said quietly. She folded the paper one, remember? Michael took her to a jeweler last month, and they made it into something that lasts. Robert traced the star with his finger, his throat burning, from paper to metal, from absence to presence. Before he could speak, Emma appeared in the doorway, her cheeks flushed from excitement. Dad, hurry, the snow's perfect. You can see Jupiter already. She tugged at his sleeve the same way she had 2 years ago, except now there was no hesitation in her touch. Robert looked once more at Sarah. Her eyes met his, softer this time, but steady. We made her together, she said. She's always been waiting for you. The question is, are you ready now? Robert hesitated, then slipped the silver star over his head, its cool weight settling against his chest. Outside, the winter sky opened, stars scattering across the velvet dark. Emma raised the telescope, her laughter ringing out like a bell. Robert took her hand as she turned to him, her voice a whisper meant only for him. See, Dad, I told you, one dance was enough. He tightened his grip, his voice breaking with a certainty he hadn't known he possessed. No, Emma, it was just the beginning.